As the chosen men gathered, their leader huddled with them for a brief moment before leading them towards the nearest point of the defences, drawing closer to the 10 natives whose hands were raised in a gesture of peace. From atop the background heights, the army of savages watched as their messengers approached, choosing a flat, grassy piece of land in open view of all those present. Once within 100 yards of the village, the messengers sat in a row and beckoned the Norsemen to come closer. "Follow me," announced Kjartan. With hands held high, they made their way through the opening in the defences, confident in their unarmed state. Kjartan approached the native leader and extended a friendly handshake while offering a gentle smile. Whether or not the chief understood the gesture, he returned the smile and sat down once more. For a few moments the two groups sat in silence, their mutual curiosity palpable. The savage leader spoke, but Kjartan did not understand. In response, Kjartan touched his ear, brow and lips, indicating a lack of comprehension. Speaking in Norse had a similar result. The savage suddenly rose and appeared to be gravely wounded, causing his comrades to carry him away with cries of "Utwe!" and a small bundle of furs presented as a peace offering. Krumer stifled a laugh at the absurdity of it all, while Kjartan saw an opportunity. "He wants to buy back their leader with these furs." Krumer sniggered, but Kjartan was not amused. "If we let their chief go for those furs, we'll have gained nothing. Our goal is to show them that we treat them well when they're in our power." Kjartan signalled his intention with encouraging looks and hand gestures, hoping to persuade the 10 natives to enter the hamlet, but to no avail. They remained steadfast in their demand, pointing repeatedly at the bundle of furs and the prone figure of their leader. Finally, Kjartan nodded in agreement to their terms. "Now, Hervor and Halfgrimr," he said, "we must try the plan I described to you. Collect the wounded chief and bring him to me." The 2 men emerged from the fortress bearing a litter with the injured chief, wrapped in a blanket and bound hand and foot. The brothers laid the chief on the ground at the native's feet, revealing the bonds that Kjartan had placed upon him after their interaction. At his side lay something covered by another blanket. Kjartan reached out and grasped it. Suddenly the Norseman rose and cast off the blanket, revealing 10 naked swords, which were instantly grasped by 10 stalwart arms. The swords flashed with the speed of light over the 10 native heads. Taken by surprise, the natives remained seated and, thinking that movement would be the signal for instant death, they were completely immobile. Their countenances revealed their feelings, and a yell from the distant heights confirmed that the deed had been noticed and understood. The Norsemen issued from their fortress, secured the prisoners, and carried them within the defences. In just a few minutes, not a man was to be seen on the heights. "Now, Bolverk, get the things ready. Is the kettle boiling?" said Kjartan. "All is prepared," answered Bolverk. "Good. We must carry out our plan as quickly as possible," rejoined Kjartan. "We can be sure these fellows have only retired behind the heights to hold a council of war, and in their present mood it won't be long before they come to make an effort to retaliate upon us for our supposed treachery." The 10 men were taken to the largest house in the hamlet, and were arranged in a row against the wall, looking very grave but firm and stern. They thought that their doom would be death by torture, and had braced themselves up to die like brave men in the presence of their foes. Kjartan hastened to relieve them from this state of mind as quickly as possible. He placed before them 10 plates of splendid boiled salmon. They looked surprised, but shook their heads and refused to eat. Doubtless their appetites were not good at the time. "Fetch the wounded chief hither," said Kjartan, "and tell Bergunnar that she is needed." When the wounded man was seated opposite his comrades, with a box placed for him to lean against, Kjartan said to Bergunnar, "Now, lass, do your best to persuade the chief to show his friends how to eat. He has had some experience with you and will likely understand." With a winning smile that could have compelled any susceptible man to eat or drink or do anything else that he was ordered, Bergunnar placed a plate of salmon before the chief and made signs for him to eat. He smiled in return and began at once. Bergunnar patted him on the shoulder, pointed to the 10 prisoners and made signs again. The chief smiled intelligently and spoke to his companions, evidently saying more than was necessary to order them to eat, for their faces brightened perceptibly, and they began to eat without delay. It was clear that their appetites had not been much impaired by alarm, for the salmon disappeared in a twinkling. Kjartan then ordered 10 plates of fried venison to be placed before them, which was done, and they applied themselves to the consumption of this with equal relish. After they had finished, each man received a can of warm water and milk, highly sweetened with sugar. They eyed the liquid warily, uncertain of what to expect. As the foreign taste hit their tongues, their expressions transformed from uncertainty to surprise. One of the group smacked his lips in appreciation, while the rest let out a collective "Wah!" before nodding in agreement and downing the contents of their cans in a single gulp. After draining their vessels, they noticed a sediment at the bottom and eagerly scraped it out with their fingers, greedily sucking the last remnants of the drink. "Ah, that hits the spot," Kjartan exclaimed with a grin. "Now, on to the gifts." A wooden tray was brought forth, adorned with an array of silver brooches, rings, and other glittering ornaments. These precious treasures were distributed to the prisoners, each receiving their own piece. Lastly, they were presented with a yard of brilliantly coloured cloth, before they were gestured to rise. Eagerly complying, they were led outside the building and directed to a similar litter to the one they had seen earlier. It was simply a blanket, wrapped tightly around 2 long poles, creating a makeshift human-sized hammock. The wounded chief was gently placed on the centre of the litter, while 2 native men grasped the poles, preparing to lift him. Led by the Norsemen, they made their way through the forest, the prisoners awed by the newfound hospitality they had received. Once they had reached their destination, Kjartan bid them a kind farewell and urged them to return to their kindred. As they walked back to their fortress, Kjartan commented to his crewmate Bolverk about one of the precepts of the new religion, which resonated with him. He believed in pursuing peace and overcoming evil with good. The unexpected display of kindness had established a warm friendship between the natives of Vinland and the Norsemen, a bond that could have changed the course of American history. Unfortunately, fate had other plans, and unforeseen circumstances caused the end of this camaraderie. Nonetheless, the memory of this encounter persevered, and it would be remembered for generations to come. Chapter 14. The First American Fur Traders, Strange Devices, Anxious Times, and Pleasant Discoveries. The colony thrived after this. A grand house was constructed, complete with a great hall and multiple sleeping quarters branching out from it, where all the distinguished residents resided together, and many men took their meals each day. The land was rich with grass, which they promptly cut and stored for the winter to come, although they expected it to be mild enough to allow the grazing of cattle. They also caught copious amounts of salmon in Little River, the main stream, and the nearby lake. What they didn't eat was dried and preserved. They also harvested a considerable amount of timber, which they squared, chopped into appropriate lengths, and prepared for shipping. Eggs were discovered on the offshore islands and feathers gathered, which quickly provided enough to load up the ship early in the summer. Among other finds, they stumbled upon wild grain, which the sagas claim was wheat, but some speculate it was actually wild rice found in uninhabited regions of America to this day. Additionally, they came across a stunning type of wood, known as massawood, of which samples were sent back to Greenland and Norway, but its true identity remains unknown. Meanwhile, an extensive trade of valuable furs was established with the native people, who were more than happy with the scraps of bright cloth, beads, and other small trinkets offered in return. Some of the natives even wanted to acquire weapons with their furs, but Kjartan prohibited it. At first, the Norsemen traded their cloth and other wares liberally, cutting the bright cloth into strips 3 or 4 inches wide. However, they soon realized the supplies would dwindle too soon. They then lowered their prices, handing out stripes of cloth only 2 inches wide, and eventually reducing them to 1 inch, for furs that once cost 4. But the unsophisticated natives were satisfied with the change, and seemed to enjoy twisting the brightly coloured stripes of cloth into their long black hair. One day, Kjartan approached Gunnhildr with a new idea. "What is it?" she inquired. "I think we're losing our goods too rapidly, so I plan to see if these natives will trade their furs for dairy products. We have plenty of them and can part with some," he replied. "I'm not sure how Astrid will feel about that." She chuckled. "You know she's in charge of the dairy and takes pride in it." "It's fortunate, Gunnhildr, because Astrid will be pleased to know that her hard work will bring us extra rewards. Milk is delightful to the throat, and cream is a delight for the tongue. I believe it will tempt these chaps." "But wouldn't they prefer beer?" Gunnhildr suggested. "Beer!" exclaimed Kjartan, his voice erupting with a boisterous laugh. "You should have seen their faces when they tasted it, spitting it out like it was poisoned. Bolverk was so eager to have them try it, and I didn't object, knowing the reaction that would ensue. Men must learn to love beer, you see. Nature teaches us to love milk. But now, tell Astrid to fill 20 jugs of milk and 20 cups of cream. She should also set out 20 cakes, each with a pat of butter and a chunk of cheese. Let her lay it all out on the grand table in the hall, and make it quick. I'll go fetch the company for our feast." With that, Kjartan left the room, and within the hour his orders were executed to perfection. When he returned to the hall accompanied by 20 natives, he found everything arranged exactly as he had requested. As he had predicted, the 20 natives savoured every bite and sip of the bounty before them. They ate and drank with ceaseless hunger, but never once asked for more. It was clear that they had impeccable manners and self-control. Nevertheless, from that day on, nothing could satisfy them except freshly made dairy products. Some time later, while walking alongside Thorkel on the quiet shores of the lake, Kjartan proposed a daring idea. "How would you like to journey to Greenland?" "I'd very much like that," replied Thorkel. "I have a proposition," Kjartan continued. "If you take charge of the snake, I'd be delighted, for we've gathered plenty of merchandise to fill her up. If you set sail now, you can easily make it back with a load of goods before autumn ends." "I'll leave tomorrow if you like," replied Thorkel. "Easy there," cautioned Kjartan. "The ship isn't fully loaded yet, but it will be in a day or two. I have 2 objectives for you. First, convince Leif Erikson to visit us, or even better, stay with us. Second, bring as many married men over as possible, especially those with numerous daughters. We need more busy little hands, pretty faces, and melodic voices in our lovely Vinland." "I'll do my best," promised Thorkel. "I also suggest I take Olaf with me, for his enthusiastic descriptions may convince his father to come." "That won't work," interjected Kjartan. "If Leif Erikson sees his son, he'll be content to let him return alone. We'll keep Ogmundr here as bait, but you should prepare yourself to embark as soon as the ship is loaded." And so the snake set off on its journey, filled to the brim with merchandise, and carrying Thorkel and his companions to sea. While the snake was away, a momentous event occurred in Vinland, stirring the hearts of all who witnessed it. On a crisp autumn morning, the tranquil hamlet was abruptly stirred by an unfamiliar sound. It wasn't a melodious sound, but rather jarring and feeble, conveying a sense of utter helplessness. In brief, Kjartan and Gunhildr had welcomed a newborn son, whom they named Snorro. Regrettably, this announcement revealed Kjartan and his wife's lack of sophistication in distinguishing pleasing sounds. Nevertheless, as chroniclers of factual events, we abstain from criticizing them further and let Snorro's arrival pass without any further ado. Despite its unappealing appearance, the small bundle and its nascent voice garnered boundless love from its parents, and was held in high esteem, verging on reverence, by the hale and hearty men who surrounded it. Bergunnar rhapsodized that it was absolutely lovely, but to impartial observers it resembled nothing more than a pallid piece of meat with some unsavory wrinkles. Astrid added that it had such a wise look, although its expression could be compared to nothing short of idiocy. Kjartan remained silent, his countenance often lit with smiles, as he timidly stroked it with his large fingers beneath its chin. However, when Snorro was deemed mature enough to be presented to the public, nobody spared any effort in spouting the most blatant falsehoods, with an air of grave conviction. In truth, most of the men prevalent in the crowd said nothing, merely taking the infant in their giant hands as cautiously as if it were a bubble, worried that it might burst and leave nothing but a memory for the nurse Thorgunnar to retrieve. The rest contented themselves with silently looking at the baby with their thick lips parted and their huge eyes awed. Krumr, in all likelihood, made the most unique remark concerning the newborn, simply acknowledging, "Ah, only to think that myself was like that once," as he leaned down to touch the infant's cheek, cautiously, half fearing that he might draw blood. This was followed by a roar of laughter, which nearly gave Snorro a fit. "Aha!" Krumr cried, his face reflecting a great deal of consternation. "What is it going to do?" in response to the unexpected change in the infant's expression, which turned, if possible, even redder than before, and wrinkled up into a complex of folds, barely resembling anything approaching humanity. This was followed by a hole opening on its surface, and out came a weak squeal. "You cruel men!" Thorgunnar shouted at them indignantly, snatching the infant from their hands and scurrying back inside the house. "It's a charming child," Svend observed fondly as he and his cohort wandered away. "You must have an awfully high opinion of yourself, Krumr," Tricker teased, "to believe that you were once like it." "I do," replied Krumr. "It runs in the family, starting from my father. Our family was the best of companions, to say nothing of being excellent fighters. We may have been a bit big and noisy, quite reminiscent of Turks in that way, I suppose. "I have no doubt that you're right, Crummer," Bolverk chimed in after hearing the end of their conversation. "And since you can't seem to keep your voice down, I'll send you on a mission to find these vines that, to me, have uprooted themselves and fled out of spite since Leif named this place Vinland. I can only think of one area that hasn't been explored yet. Take a group of men with you, including Tricker since he discovered them on his first visit. He should have found them again by now, and try not to argue too much on the way." With this directive, Crummer organized his party and set out on their search for the elusive vines that had yet to be found. The first day proved fruitless as they searched far and wide with no luck. During their rest and meal break, Crummer and Tricker couldn't resist returning to the topic of noisy Turks, and Crummer's teasing comments pushed Tricker to lose his temper and storm off in a huff. After leaving the others, Tricker wandered absent-mindedly, not paying attention to his surroundings or direction. Finally, snapping out of his daze, he found himself surrounded by a stunning landscape of hills and valleys, all intertwined with rocky outcroppings and lush greenery. And there, under a canopy of trees in a quiet dell, lay the object of their mission, the sought-after vines. Tricker stood in amazement, filled with admiration and delight as he looked upon the rich purple clusters. Rubbing his eyes to be sure he was not mistaken, he confirmed the reality of the fruit that reminded him of home in days long gone by. Meanwhile, the rest of the party continued their search for Tricker, but with no success. As night fell, they were forced to abandon their search and return home without him. He gave himself a pinch, pulled on his hair, and even punched his eyeballs, but still the dream persisted. He opened his eyes and surveyed the unfamiliar landscape, but could find no telltale signs of dreaming. He smiled to himself, letting out a wild cheer that was probably Turkish in origin before he rushed towards the vine. With both hands, he frantically grabbed at the grapes and shoved them into his mouth until his cheeks bulged. He raised his eyes to the sky in ecstasy, before repeating the process again and again. Finally satiated, Tricker paused to catch a breath and cheer, unashamedly basking in his gluttonous act. As the sun began to set, he took a break. The soporific effect of the evening light quickly caught up, and soon he was reclining on the verdant turf, surrounded and partially covered by the pile of grapes. Like Bacchus, he lay there, drunk and disorderly, enjoying the fruits of his toil. It wasn't long before he fell into a deep sleep, snoring peacefully under the canopy of vines. Tricker was a robust man, full of energy and vitality, making sleep an effortless process that took him through the night. It wasn't until the sun began to rise that he groaned, rolled over, and sat up. He scratched his head in confusion, and then let out a hearty laugh as he saw his grape-covered surroundings. With renewed vigor he sat down again, hungrily consuming more grapes before filling his pockets, cap and backpack to the brim with the succulent fruit. Then he headed home, rushing to share his bounty with his comrades. His absence had caused a stir among his friends, including Kjartan, who anxiously awaited his safe return. When he did not come back, Kjartan organized a search party, dividing his group into several bands to methodically cover the surrounding areas. With the sun rising in the east, Kjartan's group was hot on Tricker's trail. They quickly closed in, finally meeting in a narrow gorge. The joy of their reunion was palpable, and Tricker relished the opportunity to share the delicious fruits of his labor with his friends. They stared at each other in silence, Kjartan equally bewildered as Tricker, for the sight before him was beyond strange. Tricker, dishevelled and covered in grape leaves and smudges, was a sight to see, but the way he acted was even more unusual. Clapping his hands to his sides, Tricker shut his eyes, opened his mouth wide, and erupted into loud laughter. The men who had just arrived couldn't help but join in the laughter. "Tricker, where have you been?" asked Kjartan, still trying to control his laughter. "Grapes!" yelled Tricker, laughing once again. "Are these grapes?" asked Kjartan with a curious look at the fruit. "Yes, grapes! Vines! Vinland! Hurrah!" cried Tricker. "But are you sure?" asked Kjartan doubtfully. Instead of replying, Tricker laughed again and started gushing in Turkish. The excitement was too much for him, and Krumar suspected he was drunk. "Drunk?" spluttered Tricker, switching to Norse. "No, that's impossible. A man couldn't get drunk on grapes, even if he ate a shipload of them. I am simply joyful, brimming with memories of my young days. I am drunk on my old thoughts, and I feel like I'm back in Turkey." "Well, that's not the best place to be in," quipped Krumar with a smirk. "Come on, don't keep all the grapes to yourself. Let us have a taste." "Yes, lend us a bunch," agreed Kjartan, advancing towards Tricker and pulling off a cluster of grapes from his shoulders. The rest of the party followed, tasting the fruit and giving their collective approval. "Now, lads, we'll make a strong drink from the grapes," said Tricker, rubbing his hands together in anticipation. "I'm afraid that won't be happening," interjected Kjartan firmly. Tricker looked surprised and asked, "Why not?" "Because if eating grapes already has such a powerful effect, drinking the strong drink could be dangerous." "Why do you want to make it?" Kjartan answered with a look of concern. Because it makes you so happy," defended Tricker. "But you just told us that you were as happy as you could be," countered Kjartan. "So there's no need for any more drink, as per your own words." "That's for you," whispered Crummer to Tricker with a nudge. "Sleep on that advice, man. It'll do you good, if it doesn't do you harm. Let's ease him of some of his load, boys. We need to make our way back to camp soon," said Kjartan, taking some of the bunches off Tricker's back. Within a few minutes, Tricker was restored to his usual self. As they continued on their way, they presented the first grapes of Vinland to the women. Kjartan gave Gunhildr a specially chosen bunch, and after thanking him profusely, she popped a grape into Snorro's mouth. It was a close call, as the first Yankee narrowly escaped death by the fruits of his own native land. Chapter 15. Greenland again. Hareface turns up, also Thorkel, who becomes eloquent and secures recruits for Vinland. Who hasn't heard of that precarious step between sublime and ridiculous? The very thought of it may seem absurd. And who hasn't at some point in their life made comparisons to that step? So why hesitate to admit that the step in question has been influenced by the brevity of the step between beauty and plainness, luxury and barrenness, or fertility and sterility? We invite the reader to accompany us on this journey, from Vinland's shaded groves to Greenland's rocky shores. There stands Leif Erikson, bold, sturdy, and erect at the end of the wharf at Britlid. He's exactly as he was when he led the way to Vinland a few years prior. Hareface the Skralinger is there too, stout, hairy, and resembling a frying pan. He's the same as when he led his hairy friends to the borders of Britlid with murderous intent. But by now his fear is gone. He and the Norse have reconciled, immensely benefiting both. His tribe was camped on the other side of the ridge at that moment. Leif had learned a little of the Skralinger tongue, and Hareface had acquired slightly less knowledge of the Norse language. The pair made quite a mess of their communication between them. "So, you're going off on a sealing trip?" asked Leif, turning away from looking at the horizon to see the Skralinger with a humorous grin. "Yes, yo, ha, hurru!" exclaimed Hareface, wildly waving his arms to emphasize his response. "And when do you depart?" queried Leif. "When? I go scrumch and cracker smorrow." "Just so," responded Leif. "I can't quite grasp the cracker bit, unless you mean tomorrow." "Yes, yo, ha!" shouted the tousled man. Kite right, smorrow, yes, tomorrow." "You're a remarkable man," commented Leif with a smile. "You'll be speaking Norse like a Norseman if you survive long enough." "Eh?" exclaimed the Skralinger, perplexed. "When will you return?" asked Leif. Hareface immediately pointed to the moon, which, despite it being broad daylight, had a strikingly white appearance in the blue sky. He then doubled his fist and struck himself 4 times on the nose bridge, or rather the hollow in the frying pan with a small teardrop beneath it. "Ha! 4 months. Fantastic. It'll be a relief because, to be honest, I'm fed up with you and your loud family," said Leif with more of a soliloquy than a statement, since he had no intention of offending the ignorant savage. Turning back to Hareface, Leif inquired, "You know the kitchen, Hareface?" Hareface said nothing but rolled his eyes, nodded vigorously, and rubbed the region that deals primarily with food. "Go!" ordered Leif. "Tell Anders to give you food, food, food." Hareface retreated a step after each mention of the word and nodded. When Leif stopped, Hareface turned around and, with delighted exclamations, waddled off to the kitchen like a friendly polar bear. Leif paced up and down the wharf for a full half-hour with his eyes fixed on the ground. It was clear that something was troubling him. Eventually, Anders, Leif's burly middle-aged assistant, appeared and approached him. "Well, Anders, has Hareface paid a visit?" Leif asked. "Yes, he's in the kitchen now," Anders replied. "Have you fed him?" "Yes, I've fed him well." Anders grinned. "Good," Leif chuckled. "He's going away tomorrow for 4 months, and I'm happy to see him go. We've had enough of him and his kindred. I'm sorry for the Christian teachers, though. They were making progress with the language, and this setback will be unfortunate." Leif was referring to a group of men recently sent to Greenland by King Ogmundr Tryggvason of Norway to spread Christianity. Although Leif had been baptized to please the king during a visit to Norway, he remained a reserved man whose true religious beliefs were unknown. He had been brought up in the Odin worship of his forefathers, but people whispered that he did not hold these beliefs as firmly as others did. When the Christian teachers came, Leif kept his distance, observing quietly and avoiding discussion about his own beliefs. "I don't think the teachers will make much progress with the natives, and the natives aren't worth making much of," Anders remarked nonchalantly. "You're wrong, Anders," Leif said gravely. "Doesn't Hairface love his wife and children as much as you love yours?" "I suppose he does," Anders admitted. "Isn't his flesh and blood the same as yours? Isn't his body just as well suited to its purposes?" "Indeed it is, though somewhat uglier," Anders quipped. "Doesn't he work just as hard as you to support his family? Isn't he a better hunter and walker, and valued just as much by his own kindred?" "All of that may be true," Anders replied casually. "If the natives are as good as you are, how can you say they're not worth making much of?" Leif pressed. "On the same grounds that I say I'm not worth making much of. I don't know or care about the matter. I'm certain, however, that the natives don't serve you as well as I do, master," Anders said, shrugging. Leif smiled at Anders and acknowledged the truth in his last remark. He invited Anders to come to the house and do for him what he did to Hairface. Anders suggested waiting to see which of their people were returning first before heading to the house. As they looked out, Leif saw a ship approaching and identified it as Kiartan's ship. Leif ordered the people to arm themselves, not knowing who might be in possession of the ship. As the ship came closer, they confirmed that it was indeed Kiartan's ship. The people were anxious to make out the faces that appeared above the bulwarks. As the ship sailed to shore, they tried to identify the faces. Anders noted that there seemed to be no women on board. Leif asked about his son, but Thorkel explained that they were trying to get Leif to go to him rather than bring him back. Leif pondered the idea of going to Vinland. Then he asked them to lay the tables and gather the house-carls. He went to get their neighbours, and they all feasted together as they heard Thorkel's story of Vinland, a country far better than Iceland, Norway, or even Greenland. Leif's orders were carried out with fervour and enthusiasm. The tables were adorned with all the delicacies of the season, from Greenland's abundance of fish and wild birds. Instead of beef, seal meat was served, as the majority of the cattle had been taken away by the emigrants, leaving behind only a few that had perished from malnourishment. Thorkel, enhancing the feast, graced the table with his smoked salmon. Once the plates were cleared and the beer was flowing, Thorkel captivated his audience with his story. His descriptions were vivid, and his ability to relay everyday conversations made for fascinating listening. Not to mention, Thorkel's dry humour kept the group entertained, laughing until tears rolled down their cheeks. His tale of Vinland was so captivating that the entire party longed to emigrate at once. Thorkel's objective was accomplished. The following day, the ship was unloaded, and Thorkel's stories were proven true by the sight of the plentiful cargo. As a result, Leif agreed to spend the winter in Vinland, and several married men decided to move there with their entire families. After loading up with necessary supplies for the coming winter, Thorkel and his crew were ready to depart. Leif left Anders in charge of his establishment, and at dawn, the Snake set sail once more with its square sail wide open to embrace the wind for the journey to Vinland. Chapter 16. Joyful Meetings and Hearty Greetings. The joy of our friends in Vinland at the sight of their old ship returning to them was indescribable. As the ship glided into the lake on a brisk autumn afternoon, propelled by oars and sail and anchored in the bay, the faces of the men and women on shore broke into broad smiles. They couldn't contain their excitement at the familiar sight and the anticipation of seeing their loved ones again. No amount of description could do justice to Olaf's sparkling eyes and the scream of delight that escaped him as he caught sight of his father standing on the stern of the ship. Suffice it to say that the joy reached its peak at night, during a feast where the story of the Vinland settlement and its arrival was retold over and over again to the newcomers. The telling of the story had an advantage. Each man recounted his version of events, or delegated the telling to a friend who could do it justice. The telling of the tale was a friendly competition, with each man trying to outdo the others. Krumar told of Tricker's discovery of the grapes. Tricker recounted the mudhole accident that had befallen Krumar, and Bolverk went into greater detail about the event and how it related to Frigja. Frigja then regaled the group with a story about how Halfgrimur had stolen the honour of killing a brown bear from Bolverk. The conversation then took a natural turn towards the new arrival's first interaction with the baby born on American land. Snorro, the baby, was presented to Leif and his friends, who were all fascinated by him. By this time the wrinkles on his face had disappeared, leaving behind a smooth, round face with two bright blue eyes and a ripe cherry on his chin. Snorro was particularly well-behaved that day, not squalling or demanding milk. He was the embodiment of stolid and expressionless indifference, eliciting no reaction from those who loved him. But he was nevertheless a source of great fascination and endearment to all those around him. But the state of goodness did not last long. Soon the old Adamic part of his nature took over and induced life, after much long suffering, to suggest that that would do, and that he had better be taken away. The infusion of new elements caused effervescence in the colony, but it settled down after a while. The immigrants participated in all the general labor and duties such as timber-cutting, grape-gathering, haymaking, fishing, hunting, exploring, eating, drinking, and sleeping. Autumn gradually turned into winter. Winter, to the Norsemen's surprise, did not bring in the total change that they were accustomed to in their more northern homes. The season was relatively mild. Although there was a good deal of snow, it did not lie deep on the ground or prevent the cattle from finding food all winter. There was ice on the lake, thick enough to walk on and sled with ponies, but not too thick to prevent them from cutting through and fishing with lines and hooks. The troops caught enormous fish with their baited bone hooks of fat, similar in size to salmon and just as edible. During winter, everyone in the colony had plenty to do. Consistent hard labor was required to provide colonists with firewood and food. The felling of timber for export was carried out in winter, as well as in summer. The trapping of wild animals for their furs was a productive industry. Occasionally the men would switch tasks just for the sake of variety. The hunters took up fishing, the fishers went timber calling, and so on. Of course, all this work implied a vast amount of wear and tear. Buttons had not been invented yet, and tags could burst off just as easily as buttons. Soft leather shoes, similar to moccasins, and boots resembling those of modern-day Eskimos, were constantly wearing out and needed to be replaced or repaired. The women in the colony had their hands full, repairing and replacing these items, in addition to their housekeeping duties. Housekeeping alone required constant labor, anxiety, and attention, which a man never truly understands, according to women. However, as a man, I differ with them on that opinion. When each day's work ended, the men returned to their abodes tired and hungry. Arrangements had been made for a certain number of men to live and eat together, and the women were appointed to look after each group properly. The men returned home to a warm and inviting atmosphere, crackling fires, clean hearths, and delicious food that left them leaving feeling content. The evenings were spent recounting their adventures of the day, telling tales and singing songs. It was a tradition that had been passed down for generations, since the time of the fall, perhaps. In the grand hall of Kjartan's home, men and women gathered to share stories and engage in discussion. The community leaders, Leif, Bolverk, and Thorkel, were often called upon to settle disputes or speak on matters of importance, considering their vast knowledge and travels. In Norse society, writing was a foreign concept. Instead, they relied on the power of song and storytelling to remember their feats and daily lives. Skilled poets and chroniclers recounted moments in history, capturing the essence of the event in a lyrical retelling. Though some artistic license was taken, these stories were grounded in truth and accurately reflected the memories of those present. During their winter gatherings, Kjartan and his friends shared their own accounts of truth and fiction, each tale adding to the rich tapestry of Norse tradition. These stories would eventually be recorded and written down by Icelandic scribes some 100 years later, preserving them for future generations. In these gatherings, Kjartan also shared with his community his newfound belief in the Christian religion. Although his knowledge was limited, he was convinced of the truth and wisdom of Jesus Christ's teachings. He believed that faith in the divine was more valuable than riches, for the world we reside in is fleeting, but the next life is eternal. His greatest pleasure in the new religion was the idea that Jesus Christ was a redeemer from sin. He believed that being saved from evil thoughts and actions was the surest path to perfect bliss. The Norsemen were captivated by his words. They were not attached to their old religion enough to feel jealous of the new one, but although they thought about it deeply, they spoke very little. They knew that the two religions could not coexist. Accepting one would mean rejecting the other. During the winter, Kjartan and Leif would often have serious discussions about the future of the colony. "Leif," Kjartan said one day, "I'm worried." "That's not good," Leif replied. "What's troubling you?" "The thoughts I have about this settlement." "I'm not surprised," said Leif, stopping to look across the lake. "Your responsibility is great, and it calls for careful thought and management. But what's troubling you in particular?" Well, it seems to me that our settlement doesn't have a solid foundation. A house doesn't have to be big, but if it has a strong foundation, it will stand. But if the foundation is weak, then the bigger and grander the house is, the worse off it will be. That's true. Go on. I feel that the foundation of our settlement is weak. Some of us have our wives here, and some of the men are courting young girls. But the truth is, most of the men who came out here with Thorkel and me have wives or sweethearts in Iceland or Norway. They may be content to stay here for a while, but they won't be happy here forever. That's a valid point, Kjartan. Have any of the men talked about it? No, not yet, but I've noticed that some of them are less cheerful than they used to be. What if you sailed to Iceland and Norway next spring and brought back the wives and families, and if possible the sweethearts of these men? Suggested Leif. Kjartan laughed heartily. Leif, has your time on the barren coast of Greenland affected your common sense or your emotions? Do you think that 30 or 40 families will be willing to leave their homes and families behind to settle in a new, unknown land, barely even heard of? And do you think that sweethearts will choose lovers who are far away from them? It's one thing to gather willing emigrants, but it's another thing altogether to convince their families to follow. Leif pondered Kjartan's words, his mind racing with thoughts of what should be done. The men were needed back at home, but Leif knew that it was unlikely that would happen. Despite this realization, he asked Kjartan for his opinion on the matter. Kjartan couldn't come up with a viable solution, which left Leif more frustrated. Leif then turned his attention to Kjartan himself. "Are you content to dwell here?" Leif asked him, pausing to look at his friend. Kjartan hesitated before admitting that he wasn't too thrilled with the idea of calling Vinland home. To him the sea was his real home. The idea of solid ground was foreign and uncomfortable to him. Kjartan's passion was palpable as he spoke of his love for the sea, from the smell of salt in the air to the feel of the waves crashing against his ship. Leif chuckled at his friend's exuberance. "If that's how you feel, then there's no chance you'll ever call this place home," he said slyly. Kjartan knew what Leif was getting at and smiled, his tone less forceful. "But I can't just abandon those I've brought here. I promised to help them until they no longer require my services." Leif nodded in agreement. "Then I propose you stay here for another year or two. At the end of that time, we'll see if the colony can manage without you, or if it's time to return home." Leif advised Kjartan to make the most of the situation, keeping the men busy and providing them with leisure activities, all while not overworking them. Kjartan agreed and even asked Leif to join them during the winter months. Leif accepted Kjartan's offer, but not before bringing up the 2 thralls King Ogmundr had sent. Kjartan spoke highly of them, but Leif couldn't shake the feeling that the elder thrall was uneasy. Kjartan believed that he was longing for his home, but Leif thought that he might have a sweetheart waiting for him far away. Whatever the case may be, Leif knew he would keep a closer eye on the thralls in the future. Leif gazed solemnly upon the earth, considering Kjartan's words. "Not unlikely, not unlikely," he repeated, his mind lost in contemplation. "And the younger lad, Hafgrimr, what of him? He, I think, seems content to stay here, judging by his manner and countenance." Kjartan's face darkened. "There is a reason for that," he admitted. "The truth is, Hafgrimr is in love with Bergunnar." "The thrall!" Leif exclaimed, taken aback. "Yes, and he even spoke to her of love. I heard him," Kjartan confessed, looking pained. Leif raised an eyebrow. "Does Kjartan resort to eavesdropping?" "No, not intentionally. I was walking through the woods one summer day and overheard their conversation. I couldn't help it," Kjartan explained. Hafgrimr declared passionately, "I cannot help it, Bergunnar. I must tell you that I love you, even if I should die for it." But Bergunnar replied, "It is useless, Hafgrimr. Neither Leif nor Kjartan will consent, and I shall never oppose their will." Then Hafgrimr apologized and said, "You are right, Bergunnar. Forgive me." Kjartan trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with the topic of conversation. Leif's expression grew stern. "He is a thrall," he said vehemently. "A thrall. But he is also a Scottish earl's son," Kjartan pointed out. "It is a cruel fate to be a thrall. I wonder if the new religion has anything to say about it." Leif was taken aback by this. He studied Kjartan's face, searching for some hint as to why his friend had brought up this topic. But Kjartan simply gazed off into the distance, lost in thought. Leif cleared his throat. "Do you think that Bergunnar returns Hafgrimr's love?" he asked after a moment. "I do not doubt it," Kjartan laughed. "The way she blushes, the look in her eye, the sound of her voice, it's all quite obvious. But they seem to have distanced themselves from each other since that day in the woods." "That's for the best," Leif declared firmly. "Bergunr is free-born. She shall not wed a thrall, no matter who his father may be." Kjartan looked at him in surprise. Leif was known for his kindness and gentle nature, so this sudden outburst was unexpected. Kjartan opened his mouth to speak, but Leif was already marching off, his eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead. Kjartan could only follow in silence. Chapter 17 treats of the friendship and adventures of Ogmundr and Snorro, and of sundry surprising incidents. We fast-forward to the spring of the 3rd year after the Norsemen settled in Vinland. During this period, the natives had become even more demanding during bartering and were generally more hostile. Despite some threats of hostility, Kjartan's approach to pacifying the natives had prevented any open conflict. Leif had made 2 trips to Greenland and back. More colonists had arrived, and a few had left. Thorkel's ship had been brought to Vinland, and last but not least, Snorro had grown into an adorable, chubby baby. One beautiful spring morning, Snorro, now barely able to walk, decided to venture out for a stroll. Snorro's favourite playmate, little Ogmundr, was extremely fond of him, and Snorro shared the sentiment. Whenever Snorro went missing, it was safe to assume that Ogmundr had him. If anyone inquired about Snorro's whereabouts, the answer would typically be, "Ask Olaf." Otherwise, Snorro's incessant screaming for Oaf would be a clear giveaway. Ogmundr not only looked after Snorro when at home, but also took him for walks in the forest, carrying him on his back during rides. Initially, these adventures were short, but they gradually grew longer as Snorro's tiny legs became stronger. However, there were limits to how far Ogmundr could take him, and he dutifully stayed within those boundaries. It should be noted that although Ogmundr had grown considerably in the last 2 years, he was still a small boy with golden curls and chubby red cheeks, just as he had been when he left Greenland. Snorro, determined to explore, staggered across the hall and fell over the doorstep, before picking himself up and starting to shout for Ogmundr. He made his way through the village chanting, "Oaf, Oaf, Oaf, O-O-O," with all his might. However, Oaf was oblivious to the emotional plea. He had left in the morning with Bolverk and Halfgrimr to check on a bear trap. A small black bear had been discovered crushed and limp under the weight of the trap's heavy tree drop. The group carried the bear on a pole between them and were making their way back to the village when Snorro started shouting. Unfortunately, they were just out of earshot. As his cries went unanswered, Snorro trudged out of the village and into the forest, standing in the middle of the path as he shouted, "Oaf! Oaf! Oaf! O-O-O!" Still receiving no response, Snorro lost his patience. The blood of his long line of courageous and triumphant sea kings coursed through his veins, and he screeched with fury, his feet stamping and arms flailing fruitlessly. Realizing it was pointless to scream any further, Snorro changed tactics, shouting "Oaf!" once more in wrenching tones, his aspect utterly defeated and pitiful. Wailing with despair, he was discovered in this state only a few minutes later by the bear-hunting party. Shortly after Ogmundr tenderly inquired about Snorro's distress, Snorro was pouring out his heart to his dear friend. "What's the matter, Snorri?" asked Ogmundr compassionately. "Hic, me hup, oh want if, whack," replied the sobbing child. "It wants to walk, does it? Then it shall, my brave little fellow. Dry your eyes and hop on my back." "I'll be right back," Ogmundr said to Bolverk, who chuckled at them. "Be sure to keep the bear's claws for me. Now, Snorri, off we go. Hurrah!" "Hoo-ah!" echoed Snorro, as he held tightly to Olaf's neck and was swept away into the wilderness. Olaf followed his usual mode of travel. First, he sprinted along the woodcutter's track for about half a mile before stopping and setting Snorro on his feet. Then Olaf kneeled in front of Snorro and erupted into laughter while Snorro merrily joined in. "Where to next, Snorri?" Olaf queried. "Away, away!" Snorro cried, throwing his arms up and losing his balance, settling down in a sitting position. "Aye, anywhere you please, which no doubt means up to the sun or moon if we can help it. But come now, it's time to walk a bit. Give me your hand, old man." Snorro obediently took Olaf's hand, an incredible feat of love considering he didn't demonstrate obedience to anyone else, not even his mother. Trotting alongside Olaf, he listened wide-eyed while Olaf spoke of trees, birds, squirrels, flowers, and wild beasts, as if Snorro grasped each word. But Snorro's obedience was not unerring. Olaf's pace fluctuated depending on his mood, so Snorro soon became winded and abruptly stopped, loudly exclaiming, "Top! Is it tired?" Olaf asked, seizing Snorro and throwing him over his shoulder into their previous position. "Well, off we go again." He didn't just run. He veered off the beaten path and dashed straight through the thick woods in the direction of a particular ridge. This ridge was the boundary beyond which he was not permitted to roam. But it was an elevated ridge, towering high above the treetops, offering a spectacular view of the landscape that Ogmundr and Snorro adored. The area beyond was a land that Olaf had never explored before. It was so dense that even the bravest souls avoided it at all costs, opting instead for easier routes. Though Olaf was allowed to accompany the men on their brief excursions, he had never been beyond the ridge in that direction. Yet every time he played with Snorro on the ridge, he would gaze into the deep, dark woods, his curiosity growing with each passing moment. For a child, gazing at the forbidden object is indeed dangerous. Ogmundr, a trustworthy boy, was not perfect. He occasionally wished to do things his way, and from time to time he did so. Unfortunately for Olaf, on this particular day, he gave in to temptation, and temptation triumphed over good judgment. "Snorro," he said to the child, after basking in the dappled sunshine under a tree with him for a while, "why don't you and I take a peek into that mysterious forest?" "Eh?" replied Snorro, who did not comprehend. "It would be so much fun," continued Olaf. "The shade would be refreshing on such a hot day, and we won't go far. What do you say?" "Ho!" said Snorro, who was preoccupied with crushing a handful of wildflowers in his chubby hands. "I see you're not in the mood to chat today. All right, then. Hop on my back and we'll just have a quick look, just a short dash into it, and then we'll leave." Error number 1. Smelling forbidden fruit is the sure prelude to the eating of it. Olaf picked up the child, descended the steep hill, and ventured into the thick forest. The sight before him was like a scene out of a fairy tale, perfect for capturing the imagination of a young boy. The woods in his immediate vicinity featured tall, straight trees with lush, leafy canopies whose trunks resembled columns supporting a massive roof. The gaps between these trunks provided a glimpse of smaller trees that appeared to stretch on for ages. The ground was carpeted in soft moss, which sunk to his ankles but not so deep as to impede his progress. Looking in one direction, the distance glowed with the intense blue of the sky, while in the opposite direction the forest was pitch black. Ahead of him, however, a fair distance away, he saw a sunny spot with a sparkling pond in its heart. The whole scene was both enchanting and otherworldly, and it would have filled Olaf with utter joy if he could only shake off that nagging feeling of dread that he was breaking the rules. However, since he had already landed himself in hot water, he figured he might as well see it through to the end. Mistake number 2. Ogmundr realized that he had committed a grave sin and should have retreated immediately. In for a penny, in for a pound, was the worst possible motto to guide one's actions. It was like saying, having done a little wrong, let me close my eyes and dive head first into all forms of wickedness. It was no different from saying, since I've burned my finger, let me just push my entire body into the flames. But Ogmundr did not take the time to ponder. He boldly pressed on towards the lake. As he drew closer, he noticed the damp moss beneath his feet became softer and wetter. A few steps further, he realized it had transformed into a swamp. "Hey, Snorri, this ground is treacherous," he warned, turning around. "Let's take a roundabout way and try to reach the lake through a drier path." And that's what they did. However, the more they ventured towards dry ground, the stronger the swamp pulled them to one side, ultimately leading them out of sight of the lake altogether. "Now, isn't that frustrating?" Ogmundr muttered, scanning his surroundings. "Yes," Snorro replied, dozing off and resting his head on his friend's shoulder. "Well, since we can't get to the lake, and this is a remote location, we'll turn back and get out of here as soon as possible." "Aye, asses," murmured Snorro, letting out a deep sigh. Ogmundr retraced his steps and headed towards the edge of the forest. He took so long that he began to feel perplexed, and began to examine his surroundings more carefully. However, the straight stems of the tall trees all appeared identical, giving him no guidance to exit the forest. Ogmundr, even though he was young, had enough wilderness knowledge to navigate using the sun. But the sky had turned overcast, making it impossible to ascertain the location of the sun through the dense foliage overhead. He grew worried. His heart rapidly pounded against his chest, and his legs couldn't quit running in the direction he perceived the ridge lay. As exhaustion and terror set in, he changed his course, advanced for a brief period, hesitated, and then turned again. Finally, he ceased running altogether, realizing with horror and despair that he was indeed lost in the woods. He sat Snorro on the ground and sat beside him, weeping uncontrollably. Ogmundr was no scaredy cat or wimp. It wasn't for his sake that he was breaking down. Rather, he was suddenly confronted with the terrible consequences of his disobedience, and it hit him hard. His agile mind understood that if he couldn't locate the way out of the forest, Snorro would perish from the cold and hunger. The thought of the immense sorrow that would befall Kjartan and Gunnhildr overwhelmed him, and he felt a sharp longing to perish on the spot. However, this mood didn't persist long. He quickly dried his tears and summoned his nerves for another attempt. As Snorro was sound asleep the moment he was laid on the ground, his hapless guide lifted him, and he stirred slightly, mumbling "Oaf," before slipping back into the realm of dreams. Ogmundr persevered and made a steady effort to escape the wood, finally arriving at more open and broken ground. It was a relief to see the familiar landscape that he had travelled through before with his fellow men. Although he did not recognize any part of it, he believed that he was not far from home. He searched for the sun, but the thick, overcast sky left him directionless. Ogmundr laid down Snorro and climbed a tall tree to gain altitude, but saw only an endless expanse of forest. Although disappointed, he did not lose hope and continued forward. As evening drew near and the light faded away, Ogmundr faced the reality that they would be spending the night in the forest. He wisely searched for a suitable spot to set up camp while it was still daylight, rather than risking further fatigue by wandering in the dark. Fortunately, the weather was warm, and he eventually found a small, dry hollow in the sandbank, thickly sheltered by overhanging shrubs. Ogmundr created a soft bed of leaves on which he placed Snorro, covering him well before lying down beside him, holding the child close to keep him warm. Ogmundr fell asleep instantly. When they awoke, the sun was up and the birds were singing. Ogmundr was the first to notice that their roof was a haphazard mass of earth and roots, in stark contrast to the customary plank ceiling and crossbeams of their home. He muttered, "Where am I?" with a look of sleepy curiosity. It was not until Snorro's response that Ogmundr realized the true extent of their current situation. The child replied in a contented voice, "You's here, Olaf, and so's me." Ogmundr lifted himself quickly on his elbow and saw Snorro's large eyes peering out from the forest of leaves with a pleased expression. Ogmundr's despairing voice exclaimed, "Nice? No, Snorri, my little man, it isn't nice. It's dreadful. It's awful. But come, I must not give way like a big baby as I did yesterday. We are lost, Snorri, lost in the woods." Snorro, of course, did not understand the concept of getting lost, but picked up on Ogmundr's distress and gazed anxiously into his friend's face.